Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to Not Stopping Now. It's a webinar on nature's resilience that has been organized in collaboration between Climate Ambassador, the Climate Ambassador Program of Taisce, the Heritage Council, and the Biodiversity Officer Network. I am Mariana Coleman. I am Climate Action Officer from the Climate Ambassador Program of Taisce. And we are founded by the Department of Environment, Climate and Communications.
And I'm Marina Mulligan, Biodiversity Officer with Waterford City and County Council. Delighted to be here as part of the wider Heritage Council Biodiversity Officer Network, which is a group of wildlife professionals across your local authorities in the country. This webinar is designed to help you reconnect with nature, learn what organisations in Ireland are doing on the ground, and hopefully inspire you to take action locally. We called this webinar Not Stopping Now because time and time again, nature has taught us resilience. It doesn't stop, so why should we? And we're inviting you on a journey to learn from those who love and help nature along the way. This first session focuses on pollinators, and for this we have two wonderful guests. I will hand over to them to introduce themselves shortly and hope that you enjoy the next hour. So Kate Chandler, it's over to you.
Thanks very much. Hello, everyone. Lovely to see so many of you. Really delighted to be here to start this series of webinars and talk about pollinators to you for the next while. I'm just going to share my screen. I hope that's appearing okay. My name's Kate Chandler. I'm the Communities and Engagement Pollinator Officer for the All Ireland Pollinator Plan. And for those of you who've not heard of that, the All Ireland Pollinator Plan is a framework bringing together different groups across the island of Ireland to create a landscape where pollinators can survive and thrive. And it's coordinated by the National Biodiversity Data Centre. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about pollinators today, the problems they're facing and how we can help them with evidence-based actions. I'm also going to talk about some examples of where this work is already being done particularly well to hopefully give you some inspiration and ideas to take home and apply to whatever setting you're in. Some of you will already be very familiar with pollinators. Some of you might know a little bit, and others of you might just be beginning to learn. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, I'm going to start off by going back to the questions, what are pollinators and what are the problems they face? So pollinators are insects that transfer pollen between plants. They visit flowers for the nectar that gives them energy and pollen that gives them protein. And by moving from one flower to another, they transfer pollen between plants and bring about fertilization, which allows the plant to reproduce. On the island of Ireland, most pollination is done by wild bees, but also hoverflies and butterflies and moths. And we have over 100 different bee species on the island of Ireland, which is a number that kind of astonished me when I first heard it. But before I move on and talk a bit about those, I want to take us on a very brief digression. Have you noticed that there really are bees everywhere at the moment? And I don't mean real bees going about doing their business around us. I mean on accessories, soft furnishings, clothing. These are just a few examples that I found online yesterday. And I always find this really fascinating because if the abundance of bees in our material culture was an indication of their actual abundance, then our job would be done. There'd be no need for the pollinator plan. They'd be thriving. So I think it's worth just asking ourselves, what does this mean? It kind of suggests that we have a fascination with bees. You probably wouldn't find many examples of ants or wasps or spiders occupying the same niche in this sort of way. And I think it would require a full talk in itself to delve into this properly. But I think it's just worth reflecting on why bees are so prevalent in our material and popular culture. Is it just a fad of consumerism, feeding our desire for stuff and entertainment, or does it actually reflect a deeper attachment, something that we can somehow access, channel, and turn into action? So that's just something, I don't have the answers, that's just something for you to go away and ponder on, as I think it's a really interesting question. But back to the real bees. As I mentioned, we've got over 100 different types of bee on the island of Ireland. We've got one native honeybee, the Irish black bee. These live in hives and are usually kept by beekeepers. Then we have 21 bumblebees, like this white-tailed bumblebee here, live in colonies with a queen. But the vast majority of our wild bees are what we call solitary bees. There's about 80 of those on the island of Ireland. And they nest alone. They make nests, solitary nests, not in colonies. So just to give you an idea of how many different varieties there are, these are all our bumblebees. This is a poster you can download from our website, pollinators.ie. Some of them are quite difficult to tell apart. Others are quite distinctive. You can see they've got different coloured tails, different coloured bodies. If you want to know a little bit more about how to tell the difference between them, we've got a free online course on our website that takes you through how to identify the most common bumblebees. And then these are all our solitary bees. And often you'll find they don't look like what you'd imagine a bee would look like at all. They often look more like flies or wasps, and they're often very small indeed. And what we find is that often solitary bees are among the best pollinators because unlike honeybees and bumblebees, they haven't evolved to carry a compact pollen packet or pollen basket. And these are the things where if you're watching a bumblebee or a honeybee foraging for pollen or nectar, you'll see that on their legs they have usually a yellow clump. And that's pollen that they've gathered and are carrying in literal like little panniers, little baskets on their legs. And it's a really efficient way of carrying as much pollen as possible back to the nest or the hive. Solitary bees don't have this. They haven't evolved this ability, so they tend to gather pollen more loosely into either very loose pollen packets or just onto the hairs on their body. So this means when they fly, the pollen disperses far more easily, which isn't great for them because it means they're not very efficient at gathering pollen, but it's fantastic for the plants because it means it's going everywhere when they fly. And some of these solitary bees are what we call cavity nesting bees, and they would make their nests in holes in wood, dry stone walls, masonry, existing holes, and they would also be the ones that would use your insect or bee hotels. But the majority of them are what we call mining bees, and they make their nests in holes in bare earth, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So what's the problem? 1/3 of bee species on the island of Ireland is threatened with extinction. And this is because we have drastically reduced the habitats that provide them with food and safe nesting sites. Also because of pests and disease, use of pesticides and climate change. Bumblebees tend to forage about 1 kilometre from their nest, and solitary bees only forage within a few hundred metres. So you can see why it's really important that we have plenty of opportunities for them to get that nectar and pollen throughout the landscape. 78% of our plants are pollinated by insects. That includes trees and flowers, and 100 crops globally provide about 90% of the world's food, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. But of these, 71 are pollinated by bees. So you can see how we really need pollinators to ensure the sustainability of our food production. We need them for our own survival, to protect the health of the environment. But of course, these creatures deserve a landscape that supports them for their own sake, and I don't think that's spoken about enough. But the good news is there are very simple actions we can take to help them, and I'm going to, over the next while, just go over what those actions are. They're based on evidence, they're based on what we know pollinators need. We update these actions in response to new research emerging from the Irish Pollinator Research Network. And I hope that there's going to be something in here that will inspire you to maybe take one of these ideas away and do them at home or in your communities. But before I move on, just to let you know, we've got a number of resources on pollinators.ie that cover all of these actions in much more detail. So don't worry about taking notes because it's all on our website. So these are our guidelines for local communities. It's available as Gaeilge as well, and it's a good place to start if you want to start taking action in your community. But we've also got guidelines for schools, businesses, councils, farmers, sports clubs, faith communities, group water scheme sites, wind farms and solar farms. There's a load more as well. And broadly, the actions in here are all the same, but they're just tailored to particular context. So, for instance, in the sports club guide, there's advice around how you can plant pollinator-friendly flowers in your club colours. Faith communities about creating a pollinator-friendly prayer garden. So you can download all these for free from pollinators.ie if you go to the resources tab. So before you do anything, protect what's already there. And I think it's really easy in our enthusiasm to want to jump right in and get started and get our hands dirty, plant trees or sow seeds, and I'll come back to that later on. But it's not always a one size fits all. Not every action is the right action for every space. So before you do anything, you want to take a look around you. What's the space you want to improve for pollinators? What's already there? Are there native wildflowers that are naturally occurring? Is there native flowering hedgerows, trees? What is already providing a lifeline for pollinators and biodiversity? And make it a priority to protect these habitats and enhance them. And think about how you can join the dots between them as well and create ecological corridors, those all-important networks that help pollinators move through our landscape. So once you've done that, one of the best things you can do for pollinators is don't mow, let it grow. And if you follow us on social media, you will hear us banging on about this a lot, but it really is one of the best things you can do. As we've seen, pollinators are in trouble because of the loss of food and habitat, what we call species-rich grassland, and that includes a wide variety of the native wildflowers they have evolved alongside. And reducing mowing, what that does is allow native wildflowers to emerge naturally from the soil. You don't usually need to sow anything. It's amazing what is already in the seed bank under the soil, waiting for a chance to emerge. Some of you might have done No Mow May, and that's a really good place to start. But reducing mowing across the summer is one of the best things you can do for pollinators. And there's a couple of different options depending on the space you have. You could create a short flowering meadow, and that's a cut every 6 weeks, starting in mid-April, which allows dandelions to bloom and then clovers later in the year. Or you could do a long flowering meadow, and that's cut once a year in September, allowing the seeds to drop in August. And that can take a couple of years to fully establish because at first the soil will be too fertile to support a lot of wildflowers. So you mow less, remove the grass cuttings, crucially for both of these options when you do mow, and that prevents it from going back into the soil and raising the fertility. You want low fertility soil for wildflowers. And meadows can be a little bit challenging, particularly in areas where green spaces are used for a variety of activities. So you want to choose these areas really carefully. If you are planning it in a community or public space, think about how that space is already used. If it's used heavily for sports, then for example, it might not be ideal, but there might be areas around the edge that you can turn into a short flowering meadow strips. And you'll also make sure that you need to litter pick the meadow before mowing. So if an area is particularly prone to littering or dog fouling, that might not be ideal for a long flowering meadow. So it's just about being a bit thoughtful about where you're choosing, what are the other land uses that might impact it, because you want it to be sustainable. You want it to last as long as possible. And the best way to do that is to plan carefully based around what's happening there to make sure you're choosing the right option for that space. And the other thing to say about meadows is that long flowering meadows in particular, off season, can look a little bit messy. And this can lead to complaints if you are managing them in public areas. And councils get a lot of complaints if they leave grassy areas to turn into meadows, which is why it's really important if you have a local authority who's trying to create meadows in this way in public spaces, tell them you like it being there, because we hear from councils all the time who are telling us that they're getting so many complaints about the grass growing long, and they often hear negative feedback more than positive, which can create a bit of a distorted view on how the meadow's being received. So it's not something that you think about automatically, but because sometimes it's far easier to notice things when they're not quite right. But if you like something that's going on, it's equally as important to say, yeah, like this, keep going. Some groups have also had success with mowing paths through the meadow or just strips around the edge, because that shows that the meadow is being managed deliberately and it's not just a neglected area. And this is an example from Woodstown Residents Association in Dublin, who did a spiral shape at the opening of the entrance to their estate. Or you can use signage to explain as well. We've got free signage templates that you can download from our website. These ones give a little bit more detail about what the meadow might look like at different times of year, and what might pop up. And these are available in Irish as well. And then just, it's the Irish ones there. Just a really good example from Abbey Leaks. A couple of years ago, the Tidy Towns there led a community haymaking day. So they had a chat with the local church. There was a bit of land that the church owned that wasn't being used. So they said, can we turn it into a long flowering meadow? And they worked with the Laois Offaly Wildlife Trust to learn how to scythe. And then for Heritage Week, they ran a community haymaking day. They scythed the meadow and gathered them into stacks. The community helped with all of that. And that was just fantastic because not only did they create a meadow, which was excellent for pollinators and biodiversity, they used a very low carbon way of mowing that meadow, turned it into a social event. So it was bringing people together. It was an opportunity to learn new skills. So it was ticking a lot of these sustainability boxes. And it was just a fantastic example of how you can get really creative with meadow management and turn it into an opportunity for the wider community as well. Then moving on to the next action, protecting and creating native hedgerow. And this might include plants like hawthorn, also called whitethorn and blackthorn. And these flower in spring, so earlier in the year when there's not much food around, providing food for pollinators when they come out of hibernation. Queen bumblebees emerge in early spring and they start to look for somewhere to nest. And at that point in their life cycle, they need access to thousands of flowers. So early food is really vital. And again, hedgerows are great ways of forming those ecological corridors that I mentioned earlier. So if you're managing a hedgerow, let it grow into a sort of natural A shape rather than cutting it into a neat box shape. And the important thing to remember is that flowers will grow on older wood. So if you're cutting it every year, you're not going to get a good growth of blossom. So we suggest cutting if you have to on a 3-year rotation rather than once a year, and that will allow more blossom to emerge. And we've got a guide for hedgerow, managing hedgerows for pollinators that you can download on our website. Another couple of examples then, Woodstown planted a new hedgerow along the M50 in Dublin, linking existing hedgerows with the motorway, and that created a wildlife corridor down from the Dublin Hills. And then Julianstown Community Gardens in County Meath planted a double row of native Irish hedging when the council were putting in a new drainage system, and they thought it would be a good opportunity to replace the fence that had already been there. So it's just a good example of sometimes you can sort of take advantage of what is already going on and, you know, see opportunities as they arise for planting hedgerow or doing any of these actions. And then on a similar theme, planting pollinator-friendly trees. And native trees and shrubs like willow, rowan, and crabapple and holly support a huge number of insects, including pollinators. They also often flower quite early. Anyone who's seen a willow in flower early in the spring will know that they can just be absolutely teeming with bumblebees. And more broadly, as you know, trees contribute to a healthy climate and biodiversity, and they support a huge variety of organisms, not just pollinators. So you can plant a young tree in the autumn or winter or grow them from seed. And you can also get small varieties that are good for smaller spaces or gardens. But the key thing to remember with tree planting is you want to choose the right tree. So Irish local provenance where possible to prevent the spread of disease from importing trees. You want to pick the right space. So again, think about what that tree is going to do in the future. Is it going to have fruit that might drop onto a pavement? Is it going to block light from a building? And again, it's just going back to that concept of making sure whatever you're doing is sustainable in the long term. You don't want to plant a tree that then's going to grow and you're going to get calls to cut it down. You want it to last as long as possible. So think about the future of the tree and if that's the best location for it. And then right place. Again, it kind of goes back to what I said at the start about looking and sort of seeing what's around you. we need a variety of habitats for a healthy ecosystem. And sometimes if there's, for instance, a really great species-rich meadow, you don't necessarily want to be digging that up to plant trees. It might be good enough as it is. Same goes for other habitats too. So just be, do a bit of planning about, okay, where is this going to go? Is this the right action for this space? And a couple of good examples. Monaghan did a dispersed urban orchard mapping project a few years ago. So they invited everyone to come and buy a fruit tree for a fiver, tell them where they were going to plant it in Monaghan, and then that allowed them to build a map of where these fruit trees were around the town and get a sense of where the ecological corridors were, where there were fruit trees, where they might need to, enhance habitat elsewhere. And like I said earlier, you don't need a huge amount of space. Just a few trees can make a difference. And I'm sure many of you will be familiar with organisations like pocket forests and stepping stone forests that are working to plant trees in smaller spaces as well. And Rathgar Parish in Dublin did that in their church grounds and have a mini biodiversity garden there with some native trees. Next one then is a really big one. And this is about avoiding pesticides. And I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted here, but pesticides include herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides. These are really potent chemical cocktails that have been found to kill, harm, and even disorientate pollinators, preventing them from getting back to their nest. One of the best things you can do is avoid using them altogether. If you buy plants at a garden centre, ask if they've been treated with chemicals, because even bee-friendly labeled ones might have been treated with pesticides, and it's just about generating that demand for pesticide-free products where we can. Part of this is about changing the way we view weeds, because often these, maligned plants are really valuable food sources for pollinators. At the National Biodiversity Data Centre, we get records sent to us every year with pictures of bees and what they're feeding on. And we gather these results and every year generate a list of the most popular plants that bees are foraging on. And for the past 2 years at least, dandelions have come top of that list every single time by quite a significant margin. Really, really important native wildflowers that deserve to be celebrated. If you have to remove some plants, and sometimes plants do have to be removed for health and safety or other reasons, try and do it by hand or using alternatives. And this is still something that's in development. There's a lot of trials going on into pesticide alternatives. And at the moment, we're currently gathering feedback from councils and our partners and supporters into pesticide alternatives that they've used. And we'll be providing some more information about that over the coming months so we can start to get a bit more of an idea of what's working and what isn't. Just one final point on pesticides is that sometimes they can't be avoided, like if you're trying to remove invasive species such as Japanese knotweed, but other than that, try and avoid them altogether. The next action is around creating nesting habitat. And as I mentioned earlier, most bees don't live in beehives. They nest in hedgerows, wild areas, dry stone walls, long grass, and even in the ground in the case of the mining bees. So I don't know if you can see that, if that might be quite small, but that's a common carder bee, type of bumblebee, emerging from its nest in just some long tussocky grass. They would lay their eggs just on the surface of the soil there. Really great habitat for them. So making a nesting site for wild bees can be as simple as just scraping back some bare earth for mining bees, leaving some areas to grow wild, like here, or just drilling holes in unvarnished wood for solitary cavity nesting bees. You don't necessarily need a fancy big bee hotel. You can just drill some wood. It's cheaper and will last a bit longer as well in some cases. And we've already seen that it's really important that bees have a food source near their nest. So make sure wherever you're creating this nesting site, there's a food source nearby. And this is a really good example of where sometimes the good nesting sites for bees aren't always where you expect. So this is from some scrambler tracks in Woodstown and dumped earth spoils, which they didn't plan for them to be there. In some ways, they weren't ideal. But they were great nesting habitats for mining bees, and you probably can't see it. It's very, very small, but you can see holes that the mining bees have made in these areas of bare earth. Nice free draining southeast facing earth, perfect for them. And they've already had wildflowers start to pop up on these earth spoils as well. The next one then, just whizzing through because I'm conscious of time, pollinator-friendly planting. And this is another big one. And the first thing to say about this is that generally native plants are far better for pollinators than non-native, what we call ornamental plants. And this is because they will have evolved alongside our native pollinators. But sometimes ornamental plants can sort of help supplement that food supply if they're used in the right places. So gardens, parks, managed settings rather than the wider landscape. We've got a guideline, there's just pages from this here, top 10 pollinator-friendly plants for different situations. And that just gives you an overview of the type of pollen and nectar-rich plants that you can use in different settings. Not all plants are pollinator-friendly. Some plants like daffodils, tulips, begonias, they're not great sources of nectar and pollen. Perennials are generally better than annuals. And generally, when you're planning what to plant, we suggest trying to make sure that there's something in flower throughout the year, so you're getting that constant food supply for pollinators. So loads of advice in that guide. Bidens and bacopa are good options for hanging baskets. Heathers are good for places like roundabouts, because they're quite low maintenance. And again, that early flowering nectar source is fantastic. And then you've also got herbs like thyme and rosemary. And some bulbs as well, like snowdrops, crocuses, grape, hyacinth, again, providing that early source of food. So lots of different options depending on what space you have. And just a couple of examples, again, from Abbey Leaks, they had a incredible edible planter project where they planted herbs. So I think it was rosemary, sage, thyme, planted them in containers around the town, and they invited the community to snip away at what they wanted sustainably. So the community was getting a benefit from it, but then there was also plenty left to grow into flowers for pollinators. And Clonmel a few years ago ran a bucket of bulbs initiative with local schools where they distributed pollinator-friendly bulbs through school children in the community. So you can get really creative with this action. There's lots of different options. And if you want to really get your teeth into something, you could consider creating a pollinator-friendly sensory garden. And these are places where there are opportunities to connect with nature through the senses. And they're becoming more and more popular as we learn about the importance of connecting to nature for our own mental health and well-being. But you can also make them pollinator-friendly at the same time. So this is a flyer, again, that you can download from our website to give you some ideas about that. And the next three things are a few things you need to be a little bit wary of, and some of them might surprise you. The first one is be careful with honeybee hives. And the first thing to say about this is that all our pollinators are important and have a role to play. We have our wonderful Irish black bee, the native honeybee. But on the island of Ireland, that one native honeybee, fortunately, isn't currently in decline. It's the bumblebees and solitary bees that are struggling that little bit more. And what studies are showing is if there are too many honeybee hives in the landscape, that can create competition with the bumblebees and solitary bees. So it just adds to the pressure that they're already under. So if you want to start a new hobby, then, and you want to do beekeeping, go for it, but not necessarily for biodiversity. And if you are thinking of getting a hive of honeybees, do get in touch with your local beekeeping association to learn how to keep it healthy, prevent spreading diseases. There are loads of fantastic organisations up and down the country who are doing great work, particularly to protect our Irish black bee. And actually, I think the Federation of Irish Beekeepers Association is having their annual conference this weekend, the last weekend in July. So that might be worth attending if you're interested in exploring beekeeping. And I think this is a really great example, just speaking to those of you who are on the Climate Ambassadors Network, of how sometimes certain actions are great for some aspects of sustainability, but not the best choice for others. Like keeping bees is excellent for generating local produce, people learning new skills, helping people's well-being. But for biodiversity, you might be better off turning to another action first, like making sure there's enough food and shelter for wild bees as well. And sometimes these actions might overlap. Like you could add pollinator-friendly plants to a rain garden for SUD, sustainable and drainage systems. But adding a green roof, for example, might be a good action for climate mitigation, but not necessarily the first one you turn to again for biodiversity, where it might be better to restore a native meadow as a first port of call. So just as climate ambassadors, when you're thinking about taking action for climate or any aspect of sustainability, just make sure you're really clear about why you're doing it and be aware of the impact it might have on other branches of sustainability so we can help maintain that balance. The next one then is be careful with wildflower seed mixes. And earlier I spoke about creating wildflower meadows by reducing mowing. And you might have wondered why I didn't suggest sowing wildflower seeds. And it might be a surprise to hear that sowing wildflower seed mixes can actually damage local biodiversity. Studies have shown that a lot of these mixes have been found to contain non-native species, despite what the packet says, and they can inadvertently introduce invasive species as well. Generally, they are not going to result in that all-important species-rich grassland that we spoke about earlier. The stuff in the soil around you is local and it cannot be bought in a packet. It's genetically unique to the area that you're in. So be really careful with wildflower seed mixes. And if you do decide to sow them, make sure that you keep them to garden or park settings and don't let them escape into the wider landscape. And make sure that they're native and of Irish origin. Alternatively, there is a way you can collect and sow seeds from local populations, and a lot of community groups have had really great success with doing this and distributing them locally to expand the meadows in their area. So we've got a guideline document on how to do that if you're interested in learning about how to harvest seeds sustainably. Then coming towards the end now, the next one is around avoiding large bee hotels. So that's the nesting habitat for the cavity nesting bees that we mentioned earlier. But if they're too big, they can attract predators and encourage the spread of disease. So we recommend avoiding anything larger than an average sized bird box and keep them away from bird feeders so they're not an easy target. And there are lots of other ways to create nesting habitats that I spoke about earlier. And again, we've got a guide on how to do that on our website. And last but not least, spread the word. Change happens when word spreads. That's the start of it. And so many groups up and down the island have already done amazing work for pollinators by working with schools, businesses, faith communities, farmers, their councils. So find out what else is happening locally and link up and work together to create ecological corridors, share knowledge and resources. If you're a registered Tidy Towns group, you can apply to the Pollinator Award, which we administrate with the Heritage and Biodiversity Officer Network. The GAA have the Green Clubs programme, which is a fantastic initiative where clubs are encouraged to take action for sustainability in different areas, including biodiversity. And last year, the Irish Catholic Bishops' Conference launched the Returning to Nature initiative, where they're asking all churches to return 30% of their grounds to nature by 2030, which is huge. So there's a lot of work going on for biodiversity at the moment, and there's also a lot of people getting involved who want to help but don't necessarily know how to start. So the more we can work together to share that knowledge and make sure we're taking the right actions, the better. And this is just a great example from where this has been done particularly well. This is the Blarney Street Pollinator Path in Cork. So a residents association there on Blarney Street launched this by encouraging the residents along this street in Cork City to do three things: pick a place, mow less, and spray less. And that doesn't sound like much, but what it did was that it started conversations. In the same way No Mow May is a starting point, it was a way of opening doors and getting people interested in a way that was accessible to them if they've not maybe done much for biodiversity before. So I thought that was a really good example of how it doesn't always need to be big, grand actions. Sometimes small ones can be the start of making big changes. Tracking progress, finally, is a really important thing to do. So we won't know what we're doing is working unless we keep track of our actions. So if you've got a site in mind that you want to manage for pollinators, you can add it to our online map. Every dot on this map is a site that has been added. And the different colours are different kinds of sites. So we've got gardens on there in red, communities in yellow, businesses, schools, sports clubs. Really useful as well for, again, seeing if there's anything else going on in your area. And then you also might want to think about conducting surveys. So surveying biodiversity, going back to what I was saying at the start about seeing what's already there, is a really good way of helping you establish a baseline so you can see the impact of your own actions, but also helping us understand a little bit more about insect abundance and biodiversity in Ireland. So there's a couple of things you could do. A really simple one is a flower insect timed count, or a fit count, which is where you watch a patch of flowers for 10 minutes and count how many insects visit. And you don't need to be an expert. You just need to be able to tell the difference between a bee and a butterfly and fly. We've got a free app for that you can download from our website. And it's also a really nice mindful activity as well on a sunny day. And then if you want to get a little bit more involved, the National Biodiversity Data Centre runs the Bumblebee Monitoring Scheme, which is where you walk a fixed 1 to 2 kilometre route every month between March and October and record the bumblebees that you see. And that requires a little bit of training, but it's really valuable for us to assess bumblebee numbers and abundance. And it's actually as a result of the recordings on that the All Ireland Pollinator Plan started, because we realised that numbers were going down. So before I leave you, those of you who are part of the Climate Ambassador Network, I understand that you are asked to maybe take 2 actions per year. So it was suggested that I kind of end with a call to action that might be one of those 2. And the theme of these webinars is connecting to nature. So I'm inviting you to build pollinator pathways. And those might be physical pathways. Look at your space, map your space. Where are the habitats? Where could they be enhanced and improved? How can you connect the dots and join them with ecological corridors? Or it could be a metaphorical pathway. It could be thinking about how you can tap into our cultural fascination with bees. How can we turn that into action? How can you connect with others around you to make a difference with your community, workplace, school, and how you can help others? So I'm going to wrap up there, but there are loads more resources on our website, lots of how-to guides, signage templates, that free course in bumblebee identification I mentioned. You can follow us on Instagram or Twitter. If you are near Galway in mid-August, we are running the annual Wild Bee Festival in collaboration with Galway City Council. That's on the 17th and 18th of August. It's a free weekend of talks, walks and workshops all about how to help wild bees. So fantastic stuff going on with that. I've covered a lot of ground, but I just want to stress that even doing one of these things can make a big difference. And hopefully you're already thinking about how you can use some of the ideas that I've shared today. So thank you so much for listening, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thanks a million, Kate. There is so much in there to come back on in terms of actions. And I love the idea that all these actions connecting together and creating corridors. I want to introduce you now to Eleanor Turner, Biodiversity Officer for Kerry County Council. And we're going to hand over to Eleanor to facilitate a Q&A with Kate.
Thanks so much, Marina, and huge thanks, Kate. That was such an informative talk and presentation. I love the slides, and the images, I think, really show what impact you can have with the changing mowing regimes and all of the activities, which is great to see. So one of the things, I suppose, in Kerry, I see a lot of groups that are doing amazing work with the Pollinator Action Plan. And we have a few that have identified the moss carder bee. And they're working on, like you were discussing, these ecological corridors to try and can help this bee survive and help it move between different places. Do you have any advice for groups like this? Like what actions can they be taking, and what's the process they can do to engage a wider community in this?
That's a really good question. I think it goes back to what I was saying about how collaboration often has the biggest impact, because it really does. And there's a few examples of where this has been done particularly well. I mean, there's loads. Like I could spend a whole talk on it, but I'll just to select a few. The Great Yellow Bumblebee Project and Belmullet, the Mullet Peninsula. That ran a few years ago. It's now the Life and Maca project, I believe. That was a combination of different groups, including Life on Maca, Belmullet, Tidy Towns, Birdwatch Island, working particularly with farmers to enhance farmland habitat for the great yellow bumblebee, which is the largest bee we have in Ireland, and it's endangered, and its distribution is kind of limited to that area on the west coast now. And that's, as I say, moved on to the Life and Maca project. It's EU funded, so that was quite a big project, but a really good example of how different landowners and groups came together to take action. So I think they've got a website about that. And then a more recent example that's kind of cropped up in the past couple of years is in Skerries, which was around protecting the Moscarda bee, Bombus muscorum, also known as the large carder bee. There's a group there called Sustainable Skerries who found this bee, again, a rare pollinator, in one of their sites. I think it was their old ballast pit, and decided to start, enhancing the habitat to protect it. So it was about making sure that there was a lot of pollinators, tend to focus on particular plants for their food. And I think in the case of Bombus muscorum, Moscarda bee, it was kidney vetch. So they were making sure that there was plenty of that plant growing around the town. And they worked with Fingal County Council to make sure that certain areas were connected. And it's an ongoing work in progress. They're continuing to try and join the dots, working with the council, with local residents to prevent pesticides. Again, a really good example of where that's been done well. And I think they actually run an annual wild bee festival as well that ran last weekend, I think, just gone. But hopefully will run again next year, sharing their tips. So those are just two examples that came to mind. We do have specific guides for protecting endangered pollinators that you can find on our website, and we do have one for the Moscarda bee. So that would be a good one to start with, just so you're really clear on what actions are required. And then definitely sort of put out feelers with the council, with other groups, with landowners, to sort of figure out how you can make a plan of action for this particular for the Moscarda bee for any pollinator.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's great, Kate. Thanks for all the examples there. The Skerries had the Wild Bee Festival, and we also had one in Tralee as well, in Tralee Bay Wetlands. So I think you started the whole idea with the first Wild Bee Festival, and the National Biodiversity Data Centre supported it in Skerries in 2022, and then last year in Tralee. And now, as you mentioned earlier, the Wild Bee Festival in Galway is happening in the next few weeks, isn't it, coming up? So if anyone's in the Galway area, definitely check it out. It was absolutely brilliant. Just for anyone still watching, you can put your questions into the Q&A. I know a lot of people have found the Q&A already. So there's a few questions coming in, so we'll try and get through a few of those before we finish up. So Tony Hand has asked, what is your opinion on shrubs such as Buddleia, seen as intrusive and non-native, but very popular with butterflies and bees, etc.?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's one we get asked a lot. It's a tricky one because it can be invasive, but anyone who's seen a Buddleia bush will know that it can be absolutely teeming with butterflies. So I think our advice would be that it's not the first choice. Like, we wouldn't be encouraging everyone to go out and plant it everywhere. There are other options that are just as valuable and are just as good in terms of being a nectar source. So you do just need to be a little bit careful. It kind of goes back to what we were saying about making sure you're thinking about what's around in your space and what you're planting there and what impact it might have. So that guide I mentioned, top 10 pollinator friendly plants for different situations, has a list of different shrubs and bushes that you could add in instead of Buddleia, for example. Yeah, we wouldn't be recommending actively planting that as a first port of call for that reason.
Yeah, it's definitely one that I'm starting to see cropping up on roadside verges and places. So it's jumping out of people's gardens. So as you say, maybe not the first option, but it definitely attracts the butterflies, that's for sure. Ruth has asked if speaking about planting in gardens, do you have any plans or advice for reaching householders, especially when you see the very large bare mown gardens? I suppose we do see a lot of those. It would be quicker and easier to manage with areas left for wildlife. But what's your sort of game plan for getting out and approaching householders like that?
Yeah, again, it's a tricky one. It's one we're constantly trying to plug away at with resources that are accessible. So I mentioned the community guidelines earlier, which is quite a long, anyone who's read it, it's a fairly involved document, quite a lot of detail in there. But then we also did a kind of companion guide for residents associations who maybe there are a few people in the residents association who are a little bit more wary about doing some of these things, and it's just a bit more I suppose accessible for people who are a little bit more cautious. But it's an ongoing one. Like, I think that's where things like No Mow May can actually come in really handy, because it's a very simple gateway. It's a starting point, and you don't have to do the whole lawn if you don't want to. You can maybe do strips or patches. But that's also kind of why we have lists of pollinator-friendly ornamental plants, because there are going to be some people who don't want to just let their garden go wild. There's always going to be people like that, and they maybe need to have options. If they don't want to do that, okay, well, what can I plant for pollinators? Here's a couple of options. So it's not, we haven't fully got, well, obviously we haven't got there yet, but it's an ongoing process. And I think what we're seeing is that, just going back to that, spreading the word, the more this trickles down, the better. And the more you see your neighbours doing No Mow May, or doing like a reduced mowing lawn across the summer, the less scary it becomes, the less intimidating. You know, if not every lawn on the street is trimmed to within an inch of its life, it sort of takes away that fear a little bit. So you're always going to get people who want to manage their garden in a certain way or use pesticides, but the more of us that do it, the more normalized it will become.
Fantastic. Just following on from that as well, I suppose it's very easy for us to focus on the large areas, and I think a lot of the advice is for those large grassy areas where we can change our mowing regimes and have a huge impact. Not all of us have those big spaces. So is there advice for people with smaller gardens, with balconies, maybe with not a lot of outdoor space? Is there still actions that they can take?
Yeah, definitely. And in fact, in smaller spaces, like if you're in an inner city area, it's more important than ever to make sure that we have these little pockets of pollinator friendly areas. So if you've got a balcony, or if you've just got a yard or a window box, even, you can do a lot with a window box. It goes back to those herbs I was talking about, like rosemary, thyme, sage, good for you as well as pollinators, and you can just have them in a window box. Biden's, bacopa, those ornamental plants, bulbs as well. If you go to that guide, the top 10 pollinator-friendly plants, there's a list on what works well in containers, but you can do an awful lot with a pot. And even like vegetables as well, you get those like tiered tomato containers, don't you, that I've sometimes seen on balconies. So just going back to that idea of, how pollinators need food source within a certain area, really, really important that even if you do have a small space, don't be put off by that, because your small space could be a lifeline for the pollinators in your area if you've got the right food source there for them.
That's brilliant. Just actually following on from that, there's another question there, and you've kind of touched on the answer already in the answer to the last question. Jane's wondering, you discussed earlier the distances that are travelled by the bees. And is there a specific distance threshold within which the bees travel between the vegetated areas? And so, for example, when we're planning our wildflower-filled roundabouts, etc., is there potential that we're actually putting these too far from surrounding habitats, and how can we address and manage that?
Yeah, what we recommend as an ideal gold standard is having a pollinator-friendly habitat, whether that's a nesting site or a food source, every 200 meters. Because that then accounts for the bumblebees who would be going a bit further, or the solitary bees who would only be foraging within a few hundred meters. And that can sound quite ambitious, but there are a couple of examples of where that's been. I think Carlow County Council are working on a pollinator foraging map that they started in Carlow Town, and they're now rolling out to other towns in the county with this principle, working towards this goal of having a pollinator-friendly habitat every 200 meters. So it's not necessarily something you do overnight, but it can be done. So you're absolutely right in that if you're putting a pollinator-friendly roundabout in the middle of a town where there's nothing else around, nowhere for them to nest, then it's not necessarily going to be used. So it's just about thinking about food and shelter and safety from chemicals. That's always the three principles that we recommend, because we can focus so much on the flowers, and particularly the ones that are beautiful and attractive to humans. But if there's no nesting site nearby or nowhere for them to nest, then that's pointless from the pollinator point of view. So yeah, really good point. 200 meters gap between habitats is what we'd recommend.
That really speaks back to the last point about the variation of different gardens and how everyone actually can contribute, regardless of the size of what they're providing. They could just be stopping points on a journey for the bees to and from feeding areas, etc. So there's space for everyone really to be contributing in terms of protecting these different bee species. Speaking about the different bee species, Jane is asking about the Irish black bee. So the Irish black bee is our native honeybee. Are there non-native honeybees, or are we mostly using black bees for honey production in Ireland? Is that something that you can answer?
Yeah, I'm not going to pretend to know a massive amount about this, because the Beekeepers Federation and other organisations specifically for beekeeping would know an awful lot about this. But yes, there are other types of honeybee which are being imported, and that's why there's a threat to the native Irish black bee. So they're working really hard to try and protect that native bee. So I suggest, if you want to know more about that, and particularly the question, I think there was a question about how much we're using our native bee for honey production. I don't have that information with me right now. So I'd suggest talking to the Federation of Irish Beekeepers Association, or one of the beekeeping organisations, and they'll have all of that information for you.
Fantastic. There's a question here about, is there some form of certification on native seed packaging to assure the seeds are native? So how can people find the suppliers to make sure that the seeds they're getting are native seeds?
No, there's not at the moment. It's difficult because in Ireland and the UK, there's no regulation over the contents of wildflower seed mixes, which is partly where this problem has come from. And I think there was a study by Nolene Smith from UCD Horticultural Department into the contents of some of the really common wildflower seed packets like you get in big supermarkets. And most of the seeds in there were not native to Ireland. Some of them might have been native to Europe, and others were from who knows where. They were from elsewhere. So the value of them was kind of limited. And it's not even just about whether they're native or not, but also where they're sourced. So even, you could get some plants that you would find in Northwest Donegal would be very different genetically to the same species that you would find in the Southeast England, for example. So we'd always recommend thinking really locally when it comes to wildflowers. Like I said earlier, what's in the seed bank waiting for a chance to come up is invaluable. There's no price on that. You can't buy that in the shop. So yeah, that's probably not a very satisfying answer. There's no accreditation at the moment. It would be great if we could get one. I know there are companies who are working hard to sort of source native, locally grown seeds, but yeah, generally we would suggest, why would you buy when it's already there in most cases?
That's always my favorite answer as well, because I'm not the biggest fan of having to do grass cutting or any kind of lawn maintenance work. So I love the idea that they're there already. So we don't really need to rush out or spend any money. It's just about changing the management that you're using in the space already and allowing time for these things to emerge. So it's great that it's such a sort of a natural process really that you can follow on. There's another kind of question here about awareness campaigns. So we're seeing a lot more AstroTurf coming in for sports sites. And is there any kind of active campaign to create awareness on how damaging this can be for pollination or for pollution and for biodiversity. I suppose maybe this is more of a city problem than a rural problem, but definitely something we're seeing more.
Yeah, there's not an active campaign that we're leading at the moment. It's on our list to raise more awareness around this because I've seen it myself in paved places as well. You know, you see a lot of front yards being paved over. Yeah, it's a problem. We're just trying to promote, I suppose, the value of grassy areas and wildflower meadows that might pop up there. If anyone is aware of someone else who's leading a campaign like that, we'd love to get on board. Because as I say, it's one that it's in development, but it's not quite there yet. That's probably not a very satisfying answer.
We can't be doing everything. Like we're getting there with things. The following on from that, there's a question about, is there guides or actions for urban community gardens?
That again is coming. We've got it on our list to start developing this year, and community allotments as well.
Brilliant. We're coming close to the end of our session here, so I'm going to throw one more question at you. Someone has wondered about incorporating water sources for pollinators in the foraging map, especially in public spaces. Is this something that you think is relevant, is needed, or something that needs to be considered while people are planning these spaces?
Yeah, I'd have to get back to you on specific advice around water sources, but generally, like creating pond areas is again one of the best actions you can do for biodiversity. So that's sort of the thing that if you're creating like a biodiversity map, or if you're looking around, like I focused a lot on pollinators in this session, but there are other actions that have value to not just pollinators, but other creatures as well, and plant and insect and bird and mammal life. So, you know, even like tiny ponds, going back to what we were saying about tiny spaces and the value of those, they can make a difference. But yeah, I think that's a really good point. And just kind of it goes to show that sometimes it is worth thinking of the bigger picture as well. General, you know, what can we do for biodiversity generally? Because the more abundance we have, the more variety we have, the better for everything.
Yeah, I suppose it's important to remember how everything is kind of interlinked. When we start talking about biodiversity, often one action that we're taking for one species can be a hugely positive action for several other species as well. And we definitely see that with conservation measures, where we might be sort of focusing on one species as a conservation objective, but that requires sort of the improvement of a certain habitat, and so it's benefiting a much wider range of species rather than the one that the project might be really using as its focus. Yeah, so as you say, pond's an excellent option. There's one last question here that's there. Someone says they absolutely loved your point about the prevalence of bees in popular and material culture, that they're everywhere. And how can we better connect to the symbolic presence of bees in our popular culture with tangible conservation efforts to protect them? So I think that's something that we could just ask everyone to take away with them today and consider, that how can we get this conservation efforts really embedded within popular culture, and so encourage more action across communities with different actions happening. Kate, thank you so much for your time today. It's been absolutely fascinating. It's a delight to listen to you talk. Your information and your expertise and your delivery is wonderful. You could listen to you all day. So thank you so much for taking the time. And huge thanks to Mariana and Marina for inviting us along to join them today on this first episode of the Not Stopping Now series with the Climate Ambassadors. It's been wonderful to be here. Thank you.
Thanks a million, folks. It's been a fantastic hour. I think I've absorbed so much information myself. Thank you, Eleanor, for hosting the Q&A. You've been an incredible host. And Kate, thanks a million for really speaking to such a wide demographic through actions on pollinators. Lots of information there. We'll share the links for the training courses that you mentioned as well. And making this session possible for reconnecting with nature. We'll be coming back here in August. From myself and the team on the Biodiversity Officer Network, thanks a million. I'll hand over to Mariana here to close us out. And we hope that you fill out the feedback form that we've got popped in the chat there as well. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you all of you for attending today, and thank you this amazing panel. This started with a very crazy idea of starting this webinar, and I'm so proud we did it. Remember, the next session is about bats. We're gonna be with Karen Healy from Bat Conservation Ireland. I put the link on the chat, but we're gonna share with you in an email afterwards. And also we share with you a link for feedback. So if you have 2 minutes, if you can share, that will be amazing for us to keep improving. From the team and me, thank you so much, and see you next time. Bye.
Bye.